Hello and welcome to the National Museum of Women in the Arts virtual program, Curator's Perspective, Samantha Box. I'm Gabby Awuma, the Senior Membership Manager at NEMWA. I'm so glad you all could join us for this special virtual presentation by Associate Curator Orin Zahra. Tonight you'll hear from Orin as she discusses the museum's newest exhibition, Samantha Box Confluences, currently on view through March 23rd, 2025. This exhibition is presented in collaboration with the Des Moines Art Center. NIMWA and DMAC staged concurrent exhibitions of Box's work in fall 2024, each highlighting a different facet of her practice. If you are in the Des Moines area, her show recently closed, but there's a really great virtual tour of the space, so we'll be sure to share that in the chat. NIMWA's exhibition is generously supported by members of the museum. Your generosity made this incredible exhibition possible, and we thank you for supporting the important work NIMWA does. We couldn't champion women in the arts without your support and dedication to the museum. So before we begin, I encourage you to use the Q&A feature to share your questions for our speaker. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible before the event concludes at 7. Also, we encourage discussion. If you have resources you'd like to share in the chat, we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to share. And if you would like, we can share those resources following the chat with all of our, following the Zoom with all of our participants. So now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Orin.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight for an evening of what I hope is a wonderful chat, conversation about the brilliant artist, Samantha Box, and her incredibly powerful and compelling art. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. And tell you a little bit about how the show came to be. As Gabby mentioned, the show actually came to us through the Des Moines Art Center. I have a really good friend who was a curator there who approached me as a way to sort of work together on an artist who is not an emerging artist because Samantha has been working for decades now. But she was certainly not an artist that I had heard of. But what the three of us had in common, the two curators and Samantha, is that we all have this history with New York City, where Samantha really began her photography career. So as I sort of looked through her oeuvre, through her bodies of work, I was just so fascinated by the kinds of work that she began with and the kind of work that she's doing now. And as our conversations took place with the artists between the two institutions, I realized that they really wanted to focus on a particular body of work called Caribbean Dreams, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And as our show developed, I really wanted to present a survey of Samantha's work. So the kinds of work that she began with, her documentary photography, and how that sort of led to her studio portraiture, her studio works, as a way to really introduce this artist to our DC audiences. This is her inaugural exhibition in Washington, DC. It's one of her first major museum exhibitions. So I'm really proud to have had this opportunity and really honored to have worked very, very closely with Samantha herself on the exhibition, on the content, on the way this exhibition really shaped up. The show is called Confluences, and it comes, actually, she gives me a lot of credit, but I will say that, she was really thinking about this idea of two flowing bodies of water. And she had said, what can we come up with as a title for the show that kind of reflects this two flowing rivers and the kind of like meeting point. And that's where this name Confluences came from, is that we have these two bodies of water, or these bodies of work, her Invisible Archive, which is her sort of breakthrough series, and then her Caribbean Dreams work. So these two bodies of work meeting together for the first time in this exhibition at NIMWA. So let's begin with the Invisible Archive. So let's go back to 2005. I can Okay, yes. So she began, as I said, her photography career with the Invisible Archive. Now, she actually didn't begin in photography at all. Her parents were organic or are organic chemists. They met at the University of West Indies. And then eventually the entire family moved to the US. And she actually began by studying biology at Cornell University in the mid 90s, and then decided to finish her degree at the City College in New York, where she could take up photography classes. And in New York, she studied with people like Sean Walker, who was part of the very famous Kamoinge Workshop, which is a collective of Black photographers founded in 1963. She also credits her early training to Brenda Ann Keneally, who was an American photojournalist and documentary photographer specializing in social causes. So in 2005, when she was a student at the International Center for Photography, her class had an assignment where they were basically asked to go photograph and document a community. And that assignment led her to Sylvia's Place, which is an emergency shelter. I think at that time it was the only emergency shelter for queer BIPOC youth in New York City. This shelter is in the basement of the Metropolitan Community Church, which is in the Hell's Kitchen area in New York City, and shares the space with the church's food pantry. So people would kind of come and go, these individuals would come and go and come by during drop-in hours and find any place to sleep and then leave. And then maybe come back again later on, another day, do the same thing, and then leave. So what we're seeing here is a young individual who came in during the drop-in hours on New Year's and is finding a place to rest and sleep in this space that is also a food pantry, right? So these individuals, these youths would come and go as needed. And in the process, they became a very, yes, transient, but tight-knit community with very strong bonds. And they bonded with each other as a way to support one another when they may have otherwise been abandoned or forgotten, whether by family or society. So on one hand, you have here Bama, Omar, and Devin on the left, and you can really see, Samantha has really shown the bonds between these men in a powerful way, as their arms are kind of interlinked and their bodies are almost melded as if it's one entity. And I just love the way we see the kind of like bodies interlinked and the arms interlinked, their faces touching each other. And so you see the kind of, these young men are not related to one another. These are chosen family bonds, right? They are not necessarily blood relatives, but they chose to be family. Or you have moments of quiet reflection and contemplation on the right here with Rie on Astor Place. And there's something about this image that's particularly striking to me about the way the light hits her face. It's almost as if her face was maybe streaked with tears, but we can't quite tell. There is something that's quite powerful and mysterious about this image, about what happened with her, where did she come from, what is she thinking about? It's really kind of enigmatic in that way. One of the things that Samantha always stresses is that it's not necessarily that these young people were kicked out by their loved ones when they came out to them, because that perpetuates a certain come out, kicked out idea that existed at the time, which is that Black and brown people are inherently homophobic and cannot keep a family together, right? Like, so it perpetuates that kind of stereotype. And something that Samantha really stresses is that there are many factors to why a lot of these young individuals ended up unhoused and still end up unhoused. For example, religion being one of the main causes, often going against religious beliefs led to them having to leave their homes. Or on the right here, you have this image of Coco visiting her mother's grave. This is a really poignant moment of grief, where this young individual is sitting by her mother's grave. After her mother had died, she ended up in foster care, which as you may know, has many instances of homophobia and physical sexual abuse. And so, as with Coco and so many others, individuals run away and end up on the streets. So again, there are many factors to why that kind of separation from your biological family members happen, and why they're sort of put in a situation where they have to find other kinds of family. They have to define other kinds of family for themselves. And I just want to, again, point out some of the details that I think are so moving in that image on the right. Where you have that little sign, if you see right by the gravestone, it says Happy Mother's Day. And then you have these notes that she has written, the typed up, that are on the near the gravestone with little rocks on them. And her expression too, that somber expression. It's devastating actually, if you really look at all of the details. And then on the left, she's also shows us through these photographs their joyous moments of finding love and intimacy with one another. Sometimes these are very mundane moments. Nothing special, nothing romanticized, nothing exoticized. Sometimes they're just in the midst of their work. She just wanted to show their everyday lives without overly glorifying them. Just them as who they are. There's also a series of works in this series, and I should say that this first part of the Invisible Archive focuses on the shelter, and it's called The Shelter, the Street. And she focuses on trans women who were sex workers, and they worked on what's called the Stroll, which is a section of the meatpacking district in New York City. So on the left, you have Kristen Lovell. Kristen Lovell is now a filmmaker and activist. At the time that Samantha met her and got to know her, she was a sex worker. So this was a space where sex workers would not just work, but this was a space where they found ways to really support one another. This is where they can socialize with one another, and this is where they can also protect each other from potential harassment or violence. This really became an integral space for them to survive. Now, over the years, this area of the Stroll became increasingly gentrified. So if you go to the meatpacking district, so this is around where the Whitney Museum is, you'll see that it looks, completely different. It is a very gentrified part of Manhattan. And at the time, the new residents, who were largely white, eventually pushed these women out of the neighborhoods. Women like Kristen, women like Yasmina on the right. And just last week, we had a Fresh Talk, which if you're not aware, the Fresh Talk is part of our Women, Arts, and Social Change Public Programs Initiative, where we invite speakers to come and talk to the public and engage in wonderful conversation with one another. So both Samantha and Kristen were invited to speak, and they did it in the galleries, which was really wonderful to see. And they were moderated by Farah Sheikhi, who herself is a photographer and activist. And there were a couple of things that really struck me as they were talking about that time, that point of collaboration, because both Kristen and Samantha are, of course, artists. Kristen's a filmmaker, Samantha's a photographer. Kristen talked about how this was actually those days of working on the Stroll were some of the happiest moments of her life, because when she had transitioned, she felt extremely alone. Until she found the community at the shelter at Sylvia's Place, until she started working on the Stroll and found other women like her, and they were able to bond. That was some of the strongest friendships that she made, friendships that last to this day. So I thought that was really special. And the other really important comment that she made was describing Samantha's practice. Samantha was not the only photographer and artist who was interested in photographing women on the Stroll. There were other photographers and filmmakers, and Kristen talks about how some of them could be quite exploitative and kind of intrusive. whereas Samantha was quite respectful. Some photographers tried to be a little bit more objectifying, pulled out their cameras when the workers were talking to potential clients, and that could actually put them at risk and danger. Whereas Samantha was, her approach to this entire practice is not to be a voyeur, is not to exploit them, is to let them continue on their work because it is work for them after all. It is a way that they made money and survived. And often the question comes up, as it did that night during the Fresh Talk, is like, how did Samantha Box gain the community's trust? And, her answer was she just spent time with them, hours, days, months, years. She spent so much time with them in a very sort of respectful manner that eventually she gained their trust. I mean, she would stay with Kristen in 2, 3 a.m. in the morning, so there was a lot of trust and mutual respect that was formed at that time. So around 2011, she began to photograph the Kiki scene. Now, the Kiki scene is an offshoot of the drag scene that was prevalent in Harlem from the 1920s. But that drag scene excluded Black and Brown participants from performing. So around the mid-20th century, it was actually Black queer women that began what is now known as traditional ballroom, and particularly for starting the trend of voguing. And, we know that idea of voguing became really mainstream in the 1980s with Madonna and Madonna's video. In the 2000s, activists saw that there was actually a need for LGBTQ youth. And the mid-2000s, the youth were what we now know as millennials, to have their own space for this kind of self-expression. And that's when the Kiki scene really came up. So Kiki means to have a good time. It comes from this idea of kicking back and socializing and enjoying yourself with others. It's supposed to be sort of informal and casual. Members of the community, the Kiki community, will come together every other month, every few months, and perform and compete. There's also a house structure, which I'll talk about a little bit more a little bit later, but the Kiki houses are not actual physical houses. They're more like kinship structures. So these Kiki houses have a house mother, a house father, house godmother, house siblings, house children. And so again, other ways to and complex ways to support one another when they may feel abandoned by other parts of society. And very importantly, the Kiki scene also has messaging of safe sex and STI and HIV prevention services. Because this is the demographics who was at the time and still is most at risk to contract HIV. So the whole Kiki scene is a youth-led movement for other at-risk youths. So it's really a way to empower each other. Now, these performances often can get very elaborate. They make these incredible costumes. And there are various categories in how they perform. So for example, there is voguing, which you see here on the left, which is being able to vogue and being able to dance and perform. Runway, which is being able to walk down a catwalk in costume. There's face, which is essentially like a pageant. You show off your face. There's also realness, which you see here on the right, and that's centered around how well you're able to pass as heterosexual. And sometimes this is done as a parody. They're kind of making fun at how to dress straight and how to act as a straight person. But sometimes it's also very helpful to find jobs if you're able to present with heteronormative traits. I mean, we know that to be a reality. So sometimes it's about survival as well. And then lastly, this is one of the last images in the Invisible Archive side of our galleries. And I just love it because of all the darkness, the way she kind of contrasts the light and dark in this image. There's so much Black all around, but in the center, you have this group of people who are just spotlit. And it's really poignant. And there's a kind of stillness in this image. Even though you know that it's probably very loud in that space, it's kind of booming, but the audience is so supportive of the performers, right? This is a space, again, where they can really empower one another and feel self-empowered. And I love the way his hands are raised, and you can see how they're looking at the performers on stage. And when I look at these images, when you look at Samantha's images, like all of these images, it feels like it's this huge theater. It feels like this is immense world. Like it's in some kind of huge auditorium or something. But in reality, um, these are taking place in high school gyms and auditoriums. So on the left, that's a high school gym where Marcus Garvey actually spoke, hence why the title is called Marcus Garvey Spoke Here. And it's kind of important to see the reality of where it is that they perform. And again, this idea of a space that's not necessarily intended to be a queer space, but they adapt it for their purposes, for their needs, right? So they'll rent out this gym space, or they'll just come and perform here, then they'll leave, and then they may come back some months later and do the same, right? So this is not a space that's coded as queer all the time. This is something that they adapt for themselves. On the right, you have the House of Mattel. So this is one of those Kiki houses, one of the very famous ones. Mattel, obviously referring to the toy company. And so a lot of their balls, a lot of their pageants are themed after, Barbie's Playhouse and things like that. So that's just some of the names, the kinds of houses there are. And on the bottom here, Samantha had created a family tree. She attempted to map out in 2017 the various Kiki houses that were in New York City at the time and how they all relate to each other. So I'm showing this as a way to show how complex these kinship structures are. So what you're seeing here are various houses, and the lines and the dots show how they relate to each other. So somebody's house mother in one house could be a house sister in a different house, could be a house daughter in a different house, and they're all sort of related to one another in that way. And so you see here on the left, you see Sheree. Sheree's place. So Sheree is the house mother for the House of Mattel. And you can see all through all of the arrows how she might be related to other people, other members of other houses. And hopefully you can see my mouse here. It says here, me. So that shows that Samantha herself was invited to be part of one of the houses, which I think is really interesting and important that she spent so much time with them and she was able to gain their trust that she herself became part of the family structures. And then the last part of the series in 2017, 2018 called the Village Maps. So at this time, she revisited the same spaces that she did for that first series called The Shelter, the Street. And this time it was to document the spaces of the meatpacking districts, and not necessarily those individuals who worked the stroll, but those spaces themselves that had at some point accommodated those women and then ultimately pushed them out. So it's really kind of interesting what she did with the process here. She printed those photographs, the negatives of those photographs on very low quality paper, and then used a map of the village to draw the street intersections of where these photographs took place. And you can actually kind of see here West 12th Street. You can see the addresses on some of these photographs. And she drew the kind of intersections on the back of the low quality paper. And then she folded up the paper accordion style. So hopefully you know that means sort of like back and forth, back and forth. So it almost becomes like a sculptural object. And then she scans it again. She scans the sculptural object again on low quality paper. So when I asked her about it and I pressed her about it, she said, "Oh, the process is not that important. I'm just starting to think of photography as something beyond a two-dimensional practice." So she's thinking of photography as just the first step, and then thinking about how she can kind of go beyond it and think of it in sculptural ways. But I do think the process is really interesting, particularly the kind of paper that she uses, which is paper that is low quality. This is not like high art. Even though we are showing it in a museum, it is intended to disintegrate over time, which is really interesting to me. So showing it over and over, eventually that paper will fall apart. And that echoes the idea of a community of trans women who themselves had no address, right? So this is when she was making this series, this part of the series, she was asking, what does it mean to give this fleeting transient community an address? And the fact that the paper itself sort of falls apart, points to this kind of ephemeral, fleeting nature that, there really is no address for them. That eventually, just as the paper disintegrates, the community also is displaced. And eventually she decides to stop working in documentary photography altogether, because a lot of her students, remember, she's also a professor, a lot of her students began to take up this work, and she felt, well, these are members of the community and they're doing this work and they're doing it better than me. So I think, I can move on and explore other aspects of photography, other aspects of my identity. So she kind of leaves this part of her practice behind, and she always felt, she calls this the invisible archive, because she always felt like this body of work was for the community themselves. Like, so for example, for somebody like Kristen, who did and I should mention, Kristen has a film called The Stroll on HBO, where she uses many of Samantha's photographs of her in that in the film. So that is what Samantha really meant by this is what these images are for the community to use however they want. So what Kristen did is exactly how Samantha sort of intends her photographs to be used. So then she moves on to Caribbean Dreams. Now this is a different focus entirely. This is much more personal for her. This is in 2018, she moves on to this work. This explores her own identity, her own embodied experiences as a Caribbean American woman who's born in Jamaica, who's part Trinidadian, part Jamaican, and eventually moved to New Jersey and now is a New Yorker. So there are all of these aspects to her identity, particularly her very diasporic identity, that she now explores through this series, this body of work called Caribbean Dreams. So these two are some of her earliest works in the series, called Constructions. She began this entire body of work by looking at historical artwork, particularly still lifes, Dutch still lifes from the 17th century. And at this time, the Dutch Empire was sort of at its peak. It's called the golden age, of empire, really. So you have all of these aspects of colonialism, all the kind of lush fruits and vegetables that were part of the trade routes that came out as a result, as a byproduct of colonialism. And often in those paintings, historical paintings of empire, you would often find Black individuals. And those Black individuals would be very stereotypically passive objects, almost as if they were products of empire and colonialism themselves, right? Like they would be compared to the objects themselves, or they would be maid servants or something of that nature. And she was really responding to how Black bodies were represented in those paintings. And so she starts inserting herself. She kind of creates these tableaus that are supposed to echo the very lush, beautiful still lifes in those paintings. And then she inserts her own body in them. And you have all these sort of exotic fruits and vegetables, spices, these things that she collects from the green market near her house in the Bronx. And she kind of places them in this still life. And she actively does something in these images, right? She's actively picking up a piece of fruit, or she's taking a bite out of a fruit. So she takes the Black figure that now goes from a passive object to an active subject, with herself as the subject. Similarly, you have something like Multiple Number 3, another early work from the series, where again, she has this really lush tableau, and often, she includes vintage photographs of her grandmother, other kinds of heirlooms, jewelry, sometimes an own tuft of her hair as part of her ancestry is in some of these compositions. And in the background here, you see a print of a landscape and really kind of clumsily taped together. So this landscape is actually a huge reproduction, a blown up reproduction of a work painted by Michel Jean Casabon, who was a major Trinidadian painter in colonial era Trinidad in the 19th century. And Casabon was known for creating really idyllic, unproblematic views of the Caribbean, right? So here he's showing plantation houses, he's showing sugarcane plantations, but there's nothing, it's all very kind of pleasant. There's the implications of colonialism are certainly not there. So this idea of Caribbean as a paradise is what he's sort of, propagating through his imagery out there. And what Samantha does is she blows it up on really, again, low quality paper, sort of tapes it together as a way to show that imagery itself, those kinds of images themselves, were constructions. There were constructions by people. Because what really is the Caribbean? Whose fantasies are we talking about here? She's really starting to question that and show those kinds of ideas of the Caribbean as a paradise and the myths around that, the mythologies of the Caribbean as a paradise. And also, I think from a historical point of view, when the Black individual was always looked at, right? Because these artists were so often European artists, and the Black figure was always looked at by other European white viewers. What does it mean when the Black figure here is also doing the act of looking? And that is something that she's also questioning here, right? So you have that really strong gaze from her to us, and she's also looking at herself. So she is being looked at, and she's also doing the looking, right? And I think this is such an incredibly powerful image. I really love it. So, but in a way, I could have actually started my discussion of Caribbean dreams with this image, because this is kind of some element of it is what can inspire the entire title for the series, called Caribbean Dreams. And this is called the Jamaican national dish, which is akis and saltfish. And you have here a can of akis produced by the company Caribbean Dreams. And when Samantha first saw that, she was amused, mildly amused, kind of confused, because the question is, whose dreams are we talking about here, right? Like, is it people in the Caribbean? Is it consumers of Caribbean culture elsewhere in the West, in America? What is the Caribbean? What does it mean to people? And so from that idea, those questions, came the title for this entire body of work, called Caribbean Dreams. And the other thing I want to talk about with saltfish and some of these ingredients is that saltfish was also part of colonial trade. So sometimes she's putting in these symbols, these kind of signs of colonial legacies. So saltfish was also part of colonial trade when ships from North America would bring salted cod and lumber to the Caribbean in exchange for other kinds of materials like sugar, rum, molasses, and salt. So again, this is a byproduct of colonial legacies that also became a really integral part of Jamaican cuisine, Jamaican culture. This is part of the Jamaican national dish. We also have this incredible work on the right called One Kind of Story, and it is probably one of my favorite works. If I had to choose, it's difficult to choose a work that I love more than others, but this one I think is really interesting and compelling. So this is Samantha looking again at history, at art history, and she's particularly looking at this work by Félix Morin, who was a French photographer working out of Port of Spain, capital of Trinidad and Tobago, in the 19th century. And Félix Morin used to photograph indentured laborers from South Asia. So many women, men and women, were brought over from India, from South Asia to work in the Caribbean. And he used to create these kind of exploitative, kind of exoticizing images of these women and sell them as postcards for tourist consumption, essentially. So these are quite small. I'm showing the same scale, but they're meant to be handled. They're meant to be sort of postcards. So Samantha, you can see Samantha on the right, in the middle there, mimicking that pose, appropriating that pose, but then pixelating herself. And the idea of that is that she is drawing attention to that history, but then she's stopping the exploitation, right? Because I think she says something like, with obscurity comes power. Like she's reclaiming some of that power. She's not giving all of herself up to the visitor, to the viewer, the way these young women were made to do by Félix Morin and other artists, photographers like him. Right. So, and I think that's a really, really interesting idea, that you're both drawing attention to that problematic history, but then you're stopping the exploitation from further happening. And then I really love that she's showing her matrilineal line. So she's surrounding herself with photos of her grandmother, of her mother, of her aunt, of her great aunt. And so just this idea of the legacies, right? Her family legacies, where she comes from. And, I think the title is interesting. It says one kind of story, but she always talks about how there isn't just one kind of story, right? There are all of these different kinds of stories that lead to the kinds of legacies of these women, of women from all of these different places. And I think similarly in Edges, just like she kind of pixelates herself in one kind of story, in Edges, you see her cover her face entirely, again, as a way of seizing power. And you see that in Edges, with her kind of holding this stalk of sugarcane. Now, just like with saltfish, sugarcane obviously also has this history of, as it was linked to the history of enslaved peoples were being forced to work on sugar plantations. But here, instead of being something that oppressed them, she's holding it like it's a weapon, right? Like, again, like it's something that gives her power. She's reclaiming that. One of the things that you see here, that you begin to see here, but you see in a lot of her works, are the edges of her studio, right? So you're actually getting to see her, studio and her camera equipment, and that is done very intentionally. Again, it's to show the kind of image making, the kind of inauthenticity of image making, that it is not an authentic view of a certain culture, that these are all constructions made by the artist. So this is very intentionally shown. You would never see that, in those idyllic views of Trinidad in the 19th century, but she's very intentionally showing. And also you can see the way it's sort of taped up with a bit of the wall showing through, that this is not really an authentic backdrop. They're not really in the Caribbean. This is a reproduction. So very kind of intentional inclusions of the edges of the studio. This is a great work. I mean, they're all great. That's why I'm showing them to you. But she continues to explore these colonial legacies in works like Navel. And again, these are really a way to express her own embodied experiences. She's not trying to speak for everyone. This is not, this is the experience of all diasporic people from the Caribbean. These are her experiences. So what you see here is really what I think of as an amalgamation of where she came from, who she is and where she came from. So at the bottom there, you see the black and white image. That's an image, that's a photograph of Buckley's uprising or Buckley's riot of 1935. I prefer uprising over riot. This uprising took place in St. Kitts, which is a Caribbean island, and it was part of a larger labor movement where indentured laborers from South Asia demanded higher wages and more, improved working conditions for them on these plantations, on these islands. She herself is the descendant of enslaved peoples from Africa and indentured laborers who were brought to the Caribbean from South Asia. So this is very personal for her. This is her family history that she is now referencing in this image. You see that's her hand that's sort of grabbing kind of over the cowrie shell, which we know has great significance in various African cultures. There's also this corelle dish, and you can maybe indicate in the chat if anybody has owned corelle dishes with this crazy daisy pattern. This crazy daisy pattern was really popular in the 70s and 80s, and Samantha says that particularly amongst her sort of immigrant friends, all immigrant families, this was really popular amongst those families at that time in the States. They would all get the sort of crazy daisy pattern corelle dishes. So she's sort of referencing her diasporic history there. You also have Christophines, which are these edible gourds. And I always ask when I give tours if people are, like, if people can tell what this is. And I can't tell from the chat because I have the screen shared, but if you can guess what this is, put your response in the chat. Otherwise, I'll divulge in a second or two. So I thought it was dirt, but it's curry powder. She creates a kind of like mini landscape with curry powder that's really popular in Trinidad and that she uses to, her family uses to cook. So I actually really love this image for that reason. It's surprising to me, when I look at it, I can look at it for a long time and try to pick out all the different symbolisms, all the things that mean something to her. And then she often actually includes a kind of sticker, like a produce sticker, as a way to point to, the histories of commodification of the Caribbean culture being commodified in the Americas, elsewhere outside of the Caribbean. So for her, as you can see, she uses things that people cook with. She's used fruits and vegetables, and plants and fruits for Samantha are stand-ins for immigrant communities. They symbolize immigrants trying to survive in the US, trying to survive in a new environment. And so Transplant Family Portrait references that idea. So here, she is trying to grow different Caribbean plants, a banana tree and things like that under this artificial purple glow light. So this artificial lights. And you can see that there's varying degrees of success, right? Like there's some that are looking like they might be thriving and some that looks like they might be not doing as well. And so again, that points this idea that some people are able to find success in many ways. They are able to find their place in a new society after they migrate. They're able to assimilate. If you think of assimilation as success, if you define assimilation with success, but in any case, they're able to accommodate and adapt to these new environments. And some people are not. And so she's pointing to real human experiences, but through these symbols, through these plants, essentially. You also see various bottles here of different brands. So you have, for example, the Jamaica Mountain Peak Instant Coffee. This is, a brand that claims to bring the taste of Jamaica directly to us, which is a funny idea. But she often includes these different bottles, brands, price stickers, and receipts as a way to show how Caribbean culture has become commodified. Again, that same idea, and continues to be flattened and reduced to objects of consumption. Because again, how can you know what Jamaica tastes like through just having, coffee or something like that? So she's really pointing at those kind of like absurdities of marketing and branding and commodifying people and complex cultures. And that is, again, heightened by these receipts. And so all of these objects and things that she got were from, again, that green market in her house, near her house at the Bronx. So in 2021, so this is sort of her more mature work in the Caribbean Dream series, she created this incredibly beautiful, lush green photograph called Fracture. So this is an image of her in her family garden in Jamaica when she was a toddler. And you can see that she has sort of multiplied her image across the length of this composition. So she fractures herself, she multiplies herself, and it's really intended to fracture, for lack of a better word, to kind of disrupt the idea of the origin story. Because how many of you have been asked the question, where are you from? And then you answer, and then the person across from you responds to you, but where are you really from? You can, again, put your answer in the chat, because I have been asked that a lot. People are really obsessed and romanticize the idea of homeland, finding your origin story. And that is what she's trying to really disrupt and fracture, that there is no origin story for so many people, right? Because she herself is Trinidadian, she's Jamaican, she moved to New Jersey, now she's a New Yorker. There are so many parts of her, and she wishes to exist within these multiplicities. So in this case, fracture is actually a positive thing. She wants to exist within these sort of like fractures, these multiplicities. One of the last works that I want to show is her flashcards. So she got some of those Caribbean produce from the green market, photographed them, and turned them into flashcards, 4x6 flashcards. And flashcards are a device which we use to memorize and learn things, right? So here are just some examples. And then she photographs herself holding those fruits and vegetables. And at the bottom, she writes the vernacular name for those fruits and vegetables. So how they're known in Trinidad, in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, rather than the names that we might know them as. And then this is not an installation shot of our show, but it is, I just wanted to show there are 20 of these flashcards and show them sort of in more of a totality rather than one or two cards. And I just want to play, there's an audio component to it. And in this audio component, we can hear her mother's voice saying the names of those fruits in the vernacular. And then we hear Samantha repeating after her. And you can really hear the difference in their accents. And the difference indicates the different and often generational transformations that happen when you migrate, like these different kinds of experiences, the fissures that happen between mother and daughter, between the different generations when they migrate from one place to another. So I just want to give, this is, I'll just play about 5 to 10 seconds because we are sort of running short on time.
Edo. Tamarind. Sour orange. Moco plantain. Sucre fig. Pumpkin. Shaddock.
Okay. And then you can also see that, so this is that fracture work. And if you put these cards together, right, next to one another, and you turn them around, the backs of the cards will make the picture of fracture. So you can kind of see, you see that that's her portrait as a toddler. And the reason she does this is that this is a way of connecting those ideas of migration, diasporic movement as being an integral part of the multiplicities that I mentioned, right? So complicating the notions of homeland. So here, these are the experiences of the diaspora as contributing to the way her identity is sort of fractured. So the two works are inherently connected. So that's sort of the last work in the show that I wanted to talk about. And Confluences, the show is really about these spaces and narratives that are, in Samantha's words, on the edges of things. I love the way she describes it. It's all on the edges of things. So, for example, spaces that were adapted by the queer community in New York, that were not central spaces, but they were sort of like people on the peripheries, coming to those center spaces and adapting it for themselves. Or spaces of the diaspora, which anyone from the diaspora will know is very ambiguous, right? It complicates questions of identity and belonging because you belong to so many places, so many spaces. So this is what she likes to do with her photography, complicate the narratives of how we perceive and understand the world around us. So with that, I just want to show some installation shots. Whoops, apologize. Okay, so these are for anyone who may not have been able to come to the exhibition. This is the first time we're having a full floor exhibition in these brand new galleries in the post renovation. I'm sure all of you know that we just opened in 2020, reopened in 2023. And so these are new gallery spaces on the 4th floor. And this is the first time we're having a full floor exhibition in that space. So I'm really happy to kind of play with that space and collaborate, again, very closely with the artists. So all of these choices that we made here to enlarge and blow up certain images to create these strong focal points. That was all done in conversation with Samantha. Just like Samantha collaborated very closely with these individuals, I wanted to echo that same practice and collaborate very closely with her. Even coming up with these strong colors for the Caribbean Dream side, we like this idea of green because a lot of her images have these pops of green. So you saw Fracture. Here's another work called Golden with this green banana tree. So we thought the green would really hit a pop and embody those works really well in that space. And she has this incredible quote: "The Caribbean doesn't have a shape or form. It exists everywhere, appears everywhere." Some more views of the exhibition. And then on the Invisible Archive side, because these are 3 parallel galleries, it's largely black and white, kind of echoing the documentary photography. And I point out this because this exhibition gave Samantha a chance to revisit those old works, but think of photography beyond a 2-dimensional form. So she has shown some of these photographs before. These are 4x6 album photos of the Kiki scene. And you can see that she was starting to think of her photography in color at that time, before she went on to Caribbean Dreams. And she's actually shown this, I think, once before in an album format, in a 4x6 album format. But in this exhibition, she deconstructs that album and makes it part of a photo installation. So again, I show it as a way to demonstrate that she's thinking about her practice very critically. She's thinking about the medium of photography in a critical way, and she's showing us what directions she wants to take her art in the future. This is her talking about that installation on opening night. I love this image of her from the back. Some more images of people looking at these incredible. I wanted to show this as a way to also show how she thinks of light. So on the left, you see those still lifes, those still images that mimic the Dutch still life painting. So the light from her studio, she said, mimicked the kind of warm glow of the still life paintings. And she really liked to evoke her photographs in that same way. So I really love that. And then the purple is just really interesting. It shows the kind of artificial nature of how these plants are growing. So really beautiful use of light and color. And then just ending it with this wonderful image of a visitor looking at photos from the Invisible Archive. So with that, thank you. We just have a minute or two left. I'm gonna stop share, let Gabby come back, and I know there are probably lots of questions with 2 minutes to go.
Amazing.
Thank you. I'm
Yes.
sorry. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending. And yes, so yeah, Gabby, any questions in the last couple of minutes, I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining in. And I hope if you're near Washington, D.C., you're able to come see the show before it closes on March 23rd. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Orin. And if we totally understand we are at time, so if you would need to go, we understand. Thank you so much for attending, but we'll answer the few questions we have in the chat. So feel free to stick around. And so the first question I have for you, Orin, is we received is the lace work significant to Samantha Box? It shows up in a few of her photos. So I know in some of the self-portraits she's covered in lace, and there's some of her still lifes that have lace in the background as well.
I think there is a symbolism to it. There's a lot of references to Dutch 17th century still life, right? And lace was a really important kind of product at that time. So I think it might be referencing in the same way the fruits and vegetables were to those kinds of Dutch still life. It could also be referencing parts of her own family history, lace.
Thank you. Okay, and then the next question we have is in Samantha Box's Caribbean Dreams work, does she address the history of indigenous peoples of the Caribbean?
You know, I think these are really referencing her own personal experiences, her embodied experiences. That's not to say that when we've had conversations, she does not mention indigenous peoples, but I think her her photographs really embody her sort of ancestors who are who are from enslaved peoples from Africa and indentured laborers, and really kind of focusing on those experiences and those kinds of legacies.
And then I believe what is our last question, it's more personal to you, but how did you become a curator, and what are the biggest challenges you face as a curator for NIMWA? Or just in general, like the biggest challenges you face as a curator?
I grew up in New York, and I loved going to museums, and I eventually, when I started to take art history classes, I loved the field. So I didn't want to teach. I liked working in the museum environments. The biggest challenge of being in a museum, well, should I say this? I am always a supporter of, again, being a diaspora. The reason I was so attracted to and Samantha's work and her philosophy is I am too a diasporic person, an individual. And I think these kinds of perspectives in the museum world is so important. And I want to see more curators from various diasporas in the field, engage in the field, take on more leadership roles. And so I think that's a challenge to really introduce this idea of curatorial work, of museum work, to people who might be interested from a younger age, to make that more accessible, to make it more accessible to immigrants, for example. I come from an immigrant family. My parents wanted me to be a doctor. Big surprise there. I went on to become a curator. I want these kinds of fields that are so critical, particularly with everything going on now. This is such a critical time for us. I want, people of various backgrounds to take part in these conversations, right? Because just like with Samantha, this is how untold narratives, unseen narratives get told, right? People bringing forward parts of their own experiences that others may not know. So yeah, that is a long roundabout answer to a very complicated question.
Oh, no, it's great. And it's a perfect tie-in to my last few slides as we conclude. So opening very soon is Uncanny, our newest exhibition coming up, opening February 28th to the public, curated by Orin. Again, telling untold stories about women, part of the surrealist movement, and women artists who embrace the the uncanny, the unease. And so it's going to be a really exciting exhibition. Member preview day is on Wednesday, February 26th from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We will have spotlight tours each hour. Orin will be leading the first two spotlight tours at 10:15 and 11:15. So if you want to catch her, please sign up for those time slots. Then on Friday, March 7th, in conjunction with our International Women's Day programming, Orin is also leading an artist talk on Uncanny, featuring two of the artists in the exhibition. The registration links for that event will be available pretty soon, so please stay tuned for that. And then the next member virtual program we have is Curator's Perspective Remix. It's all about our permanent collection exhibition, Remix the Collection. You'll hear from our different curators who worked on the exhibition, and it's on Wednesday, April 30th at 6 p.m. An invitation will go out in early April, but the registration is open on the website. So feel free to start signing up for that. And then we have a few other programs coming up, two on site. Next week, we have Fresh Talk, Hunter Harris and Peyton Dix. They are the host of the podcast, Let Me Say This. They're both cultural writers based in New York, and it's gonna be a really exciting program. And following that, we have Nemo Nights Remix, which will be focused on the Remix, the collection exhibition on Wednesday, February 19th. So please sign up for that. Tickets for both programs are selling out very soon, very fast. So check those out. And we have a few virtual programs coming up as well. Also, as a reminder, we do record these and upload them to YouTube. We also have some of our public programs on YouTube. So please check out our YouTube channel. And I believe that is it from me. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sticking around a little later. But I think this was such a great presentation. If you have time to get to DC or get down to the museum, please see this exhibition. It is stunning. The pictures are amazing, but it's even better in person. Orin, the registrars, our preparator, Samantha did an incredible job with this exhibition. So if you can see it before it closes in March, please do that. But again, thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you at the museum or a virtual program very, very soon. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.